This video is sponsored by SciSpot, the best tech stack for modern biotech.
I'm Anne-Sophie Mertgen. I am the founder and CEO of Micromeat. I have a background in biomedical engineering, so I studied that in undergrad, master's, and I also did my PhD officially in biomedical engineering. But what I've always worked on is tissue engineering, but there's just no degree in tissue engineering yet. Basically, I had the idea of starting Micromeat when I was based here in Mexico. So Micromeat is based in Mexico, and we're the first cultivated meat company working here in this location. I'm a vegetarian since I'm 8 years old. So I have a very strong conviction of getting animals out of our food supply chain. Basically, I've heard about cultivated meat quite a few years ago, probably. But at that point, since I'm a vegetarian, I was not that, intrigued by meat. So I didn't even bother to learn more about it at that point. Actually, when the pandemic started and, labs closed and we suddenly had a bit of more time to ourselves and I started reading into different topics, I also came across cultivated meat and was learning much more about what it means and what impact it can have. Started looking into the space. What are the current challenges? Why do we still don't have these products on our plates? And started going to conferences, which back in those times were still completely remote. Really learned about what the challenges are. And one of the challenges is very obviously still upscaling. And this is why they cannot produce enough for us to get it on our plates. A few months later, I had this idea of a scaffolding methodology of how to use it for scaling up cultivated meat. The industry of animal agriculture that is most polluting is cattle. Just on one side because they're the biggest animals to grow, but also because, for example, they produce methane. So they're a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. On the other side, all the land that is needed to grow all these animals, if you consider how much more meat demand is going to come up in the next few decades because of developing countries demanding more and more meat, there's not enough space on this planet to grow all of these animals. There is not enough space. We would have to tear down all the forest and we still don't have enough space. So also space is a very big problem. They're literally cutting down the rainforest in Brazil to meet the demand of meat in the US, for example, or worldwide, but US is a major importer of that meat. And also the feedstock for feeding those animals are requiring tons or lots of space everywhere. And it's kind of funny, a lot of people, when you tell them that you're vegetarian because of the sustainability aspect and everything, they're like, oh, but they're cutting down the Amazon for growing soy for your tofu. That's not true. They're growing the soy to feed your cows. That's not really relatable. Everybody is talking about the next world war is going to be about water. And a single cow drinks about 30 gallons of water per day. So you can imagine the amount of water that goes into this animal agriculture. And that's only the ones that they consume. There's of course more water going in there as well. One is creating the cell mass. So you have to go from a few cells to a huge amount of cells to produce enough meat for everybody. But after this step, typically you just end up with a slurry of single cells, they're spherical shaped and not meat yet in that sense, they're not forming a tissue. So in the second step, you have to do exactly that. Make sure that these individual cells, that mass of cells, fuse together and form an actual muscle tissue with muscle fibers and myotubes in a more small scale. And only those muscle fibers then create the actual texture that everybody's craving, the taste, and especially the nutritional profile. A lot of the proteins are only expressed when you have this differentiated tissue, as we call it. So there's challenges for each of those steps. For the first one, a lot of companies have accepted a industry standard that is coming from biopharma. They have produced relatively large amounts of cells for biopharma applications before, like for cell therapy or producing vaccines, etc. But nobody has ever done actual functional differentiated tissues in a large scale before. So there's no industry standard out there whatsoever, but it's really required to produce actual meat with the right texture and nutritional profile. So we're focusing more on that second step, and we have developed this technology of how to create still relatively small tissues, but functional tissues at a very large scale. And the great thing is that we can grow them as well on the same bioreactor that you can use for the first step. So you don't need extra equipment for growing these small tissues. We provide them an artificial house in the beginning. So in our body, the cells sit in this, what you call extracellular matrix, and there they get a lot of their cues from the matrix, like the stiffness and some biochemical markers as well, to do what they're doing, like fulfill their biological function. And we provide that artificially in a scaffold. And this is it's not a permanent house. Basically, the scaffolds over time, they degrade to a certain extent, and the cells produce their own extracellular matrix over time. Based on some bioprinting principles, but it's also very different. Not going to tell much more about it, but like we make very specific structures in the scaffold, mainly so that they can be perfused. We produce them at a very high rate, so it's a very efficient process of producing these scaffolds. So our secret sauce is in how we make the scaffold. Basically, we can make a device out of that, like looks a little bit similar to a bioprinter maybe. So there's different ways of how we want to enter the market with this. We want to map out an entire small production line for producing customized cultivated meat products that we can sell directly to customers through tasting events and these kind of things. That should happen relatively quick because we have this process of making the three-dimensional tissues figured out very well at this point. And this is also where my co-founder Vincent comes into play, because with his aerospace background, he focuses a lot on efficiencies. Like, everything that goes into space has to be 100% efficient. Like every gram is accounted for. So we want to do the same for a small production line, make it perfectly efficient as we can make it. And then we can multiply that model. So if we do this as a pure B2B model where we sell just our scaffolding technology as a printer and ink model, we provide you with the printer that is relatively low cost. And then we make our money through subscriptions of the inks that go into it. Eventually, like right now, maybe we produce small amounts of meat just as to map out the perfect process. But eventually that's not what we want to do. Like we don't want to necessarily produce our own brand of meat at all. So it's still a bit tricky to put exact numbers on this because, there's nobody really on the market yet. So it's a lot of extrapolation. But what you can, or what everybody knows, meat market in general is huge. Just meat market is about 1.4 trillion worldwide. And that doesn't even include seafood. And there's also a lot of cultivated seafood companies out there. So no, it's an enormous market. Eventually, it's still maybe a few decades out, or maybe two. We will see. Maybe at some point it will accelerate a lot and be much faster than we think right now. But eventually, it will take over this whole meat and seafood market, right? Just because otherwise we're not even going to be able to serve all the need for meat and seafood. We envision to maybe capture with our technology about 5% of that. So it's still an enormous cultivated meat. I think the last number that I saw was around 150. But like if you consider also adjacent industries like growth factor producers, etc., like I think we get close to like 400 or 500, if I remember correctly. Our current focus is 100% on food production. There's quite, like, if you think about biomedical applications, you have to think about it to a certain extent differently. For example, for food, the biology doesn't have to be 100% perfect. If we're at 90% or something like that, you're fine. Of course, we have thought about it, like, what if it doesn't work for cultivated meat? Where can we use our technology? And we have some ideas for certain types of implants, like, for example, I think one that would be very interesting is cartilage, because there's lots of need for that as well. And it's usually a very difficult tissue to imitate. But I think our technology could be very useful there as well. I mean, of course, if we could bring costs down also for the medical applications would be great, but it's more important in the food application. There is no official framework, for example, in the US yet. The FDA and the USDA are working on it, and they're in close communication with companies that are relatively close to get to the market of how to do this, etc. But there is not this framework that you can just download on the internet yet and work with it. So it's still a bit on a case-to-case basis. It's a bit of a two-sided sword. On one side, it gives us other challenges, but from a financial perspective alone, it's quite an advantage. The advantage is rent, of course, so much more cost efficient than being based in the Bay Area, for example. Like, we have come a long way and we still can get a long way. And yeah, so this is a very good competitive advantage. On the other side, being based in Mexico, I think everybody's struggling with lab space everywhere because it's very competitive. There's apparently not enough out there. We're lucky to be able to work in a university lab at first, rent space there. And now we are building our own lab. Should be functional by the end of this week. At the moment, we are not using very specific equipment for scaling. We're using very ordinary cell culture equipment, actually. Currently, mostly using spinner flasks, and you can use them at different types or sizes, basically. Yeah, like when you talk to other cultivated meat companies that have been around for years and they're only now in a 50-liter bioreactor, working a bit more on downstream than upstream, making the differentiation and then how we get from this differentiated tissues into an actual meat product. We're also looking at that. So generally, we want to make this process as efficient as possible so that we can apply it anywhere. And in 10 years, we would like it to be so efficient and simplified, put into a box that maybe, and on the other side, what that allows us, if we have it mapped out that efficiently, eventually is we can literally send it into space and provide freshly made meat to astronauts and like ride a bit of the wave of all of this new space explosion that's happening right now with the new space in tourism kind of coming up and Mars missions becoming much more realistic very soon, etc. I mean, NASA, and they have done quite a lot of research on the ISS on how to grow cells in space. What is a bit more challenging is differentiating tissues. Like they have, of course, like done a lot of research around bone because that's very important. But applying the load to really differentiate tissues, that's a bit more of a challenge in space. I think we have some ideas of how to solve that. So generally, growing them in space is not, or it's solved. You can do it. The question now is again like how to scale this up and how to use actual bioreactors and these kind of things in space that has not been done yet. And also there we have some ideas. Having a very good support system is very important. Good advisors, good investors, choose them wisely, especially in the beginning. If they can be your advisor, it's great. I'm also just so happy to have a co-founder now. It's so great to work together. But also when onboarding a co-founder, be very careful about it. For me, it has been the best choice ever until now, but no, like you also hear horror stories. I was wondering about that for a long time. Did not necessarily want to. I already had a co-founder candidate just like when I was starting, but that didn't work out at the end for very good reasons. We're still very good friends, so there was not the problem. It was just like physical occasion basically that didn't work out. But yeah, it was like for a while I was like, no, I'm fine alone. But most of the time I was somehow thinking about where can I get a co-founder, and it was also difficult because I was relatively new to Mexico, so I didn't have a large network to draw on. But yeah, I think in Europe it might have been easier work with people that you know you can fight with. So it has to be people that you know well, basically. Well, anyway, even though I'm saying this, it's not the case for me. I met Vincent on the co-founder matching platform from YC. So we didn't know each other well before meeting on there, obviously, but we took, I don't know, I think 3 months of time where we worked together before onboarding officially as co-founder. So one advice that I once got from, I think it was one YC group partner, not mine, but in one of the sessions, it was like about what advice they can give to biotech or hard tech, deep tech entrepreneurs, and was like, be a force of nature, or you will encounter so many challenges and people who are doubting you and investors not understanding what you're doing or finding it too risky, whatever. Like you just have to continue to believe in your cause. And I think we are working on a really good cause, and we just, that's what makes me continue. Nature has figured out how our bodies work and how biology works. Like over millions of years, we're trying to imitate a lot of these things in a few decades. So we have to be patient.
This video is sponsored by SciSpot, the best tech stack for modern biotech.